Holly Greenland, who is actually our blog manager at Ally, is doing her PhD in what behavioral aspects of self-published authors. And that was an interesting one because she was trying to see, are there certain behaviors or characteristics of authors that make them more or less likely to be successful? And the one characteristic that came up as being linked to success, so none of them were linking except for this one thing, which was not being amiable. And I was like, sorry, what? And she's like, yeah, self-published successful authors are not amiable people. We really laughed about that. But then we kind of broke it up a bit. We're thinking, what is that about?
Hello, fellow creative voyagers. This week on the Indie Author Podcast, I talk with Melissa Addey about the big Indie Author Data Drop 2024, including author income data, whether trad pub income is spikier than indie pub income, the growth of libraries, the continuing popularity of paperback, selling direct, trends in KU, the power of the backlist, behavioral aspects of indie authors, they're not what I would have expected, the fact that indie and trad is not an either-or decision, and the importance of seeing the bigger picture and not just the shiny objects. And a quick request before we get to the interview, if you have gotten value from the podcast, please consider supporting it and all the work I do at The Indie Author by becoming a patron. Just go to patreon.com/The Indie Author, and that's Indie with a Y. And now let's hear from Melissa Addey about the big Indie Author Data Drop 2024. Hello, and welcome to the Indie Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Melissa Addey. Hey, Melissa, how are you doing?
Hey, Matty, I'm doing good. Thank you for having me.
It is lovely to have you here. To give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, Melissa Addey is the Alliance of Independent Authors Campaigns Manager, focusing on ethics and excellence in self-publishing, as well as an author of historical fiction set in China, Morocco, and ancient Rome. And Melissa was also a past guest on the podcast in episode 150, Hands-Off Merchandising for Authors. And she was also one of the contributors to my perspectives on episode on podcasting playbook, navigating guest opportunities. That was episode 220. And so I invited Melissa back to talk about the big Indie Author Data Drop Report 2024. So this is something from the Alliance of Independent Authors. And I wanted to just start out, Melissa, asking you what made Ally decide that this was something that they should pursue?
Yeah. Well, it came about because there was a real dearth of data, facts and figures on self-publishing. So when I first started working with Ally, I come from a business background, and I already knew this because when I moved over in self-publishing, I was like, where is the data? Because in commercial life, you had to have the reports right there, and you had to have all the data in your head. And, you know, if your CEO stopped you in the lift and said, what's the sales like on blah, you had to have it all there. And it helped with making commercial decisions. And so I was a bit like, well, we need the data. Where is the data? How do you make proper decisions if you can't see what's happening? If it's all anecdotal, then you're never quite sure if maybe you're just in a little bubble of your own and you haven't realized what's, you know, the bigger picture or whatever. And so I started by doing the Indie Author Income Survey because one of the first things we didn't know was we kept seeing author income surveys coming from all different parts of the world. And they always said author income declining, declining, declining. We're thinking that doesn't sound quite right. We're talking to a lot of indie authors. And we also knew that those surveys were not very easy for an indie author to answer because they're set up for a traditional author to answer. So it's questions about your agent, it's questions about your publisher, it's questions about your advance. And so for an indie author, it's not even easy to answer those surveys and be part of them. So we ran that. That was last year. And the big news from that was that indie authors were making more money than those who were traditionally published. So that was fascinating and very interesting to know. So not only were they making more, the amount was growing really rapidly. It was growing 53% year on year. So that was amazing. So that was Ally's own survey that was done. So it was over 2,000 authors answered that one. And then later that same year, Authors Guild released their figures, which absolutely correlated with ours. So it absolutely matched that and agreed that was the case. So that was a fantastic piece of information to have in the first place. And then after that, we thought, hang on a minute. Okay, that's new data that we've put into the world, if you like, but where there's a lot of big organizations across self-publishing. There must be some information out there if we work with our peers and we compile that all together. So we call that the Big Indie Author Data Drop. And the idea was to ask as many organizations as we could, have you got something you can share with us? And so we did one last year, and that was amazing. We got loads of interesting data from that. So, for example, commercial insights that were really useful for authors, such as 75% of books being sold were in a series, both fiction and nonfiction. So, that's the kind of thing an author needs to know, because you can then make an informed choice. If you wish to write a standalone novel, that is great, because that is your creative right. But you need to know that it would probably be better if you could make it part of a series. That then gives you the right info to make the choices. So there are novels that I write that are standalone because I want to make a standalone, and I'm happy to do that. But then there are ones that I write deliberately as a series because I know that commercially that would be a better thing to do. So being able to make those choices informed rather than just going, I don't know, I fancy writing a standalone or I fancy writing a series. That's a different thing, and it's important to be informed. So that was really fascinating last year. And so we just said, we're going to do it every year. So the income survey, we will do every 2 years, because you don't need to do it every year. You can just see the trends changing over time. But the Big Indie Author Data Drop, we do annually now. So I have literally just finished doing it. We did it just in time for London Book Fair, which we've all just had to exhausted. And so I just thought it would be nice to share some of the data that's come up this year in various different groups.
I did have a question about the income survey. And
Yes.
since this was not really the topic we prepped, you can defer this question if you would like. But
No, that's okay.
what I've always imagined is that if you took income information about indie authors and income information from traditionally published authors, the traditionally published authors graph would be much spikier in several ways, like in the sense that a traditionally published author would get a big spike of income from an advance, and then maybe nothing. And then also spikier in the sense that you probably have, a small spike of people at the beginning who are making huge amounts of money, and then it would drop off quickly to poverty levels. Whereas I would imagine that for indie authors, it's more kind of like a bell curve, where you have some people who are making a lot of money over a long time, and some people who are not making any money over a long time, and then like a gradual meeting in the middle of a curved peak. Is that true, or did you find data that suggested otherwise?
No, it's a good point. So what we did was we kind of only took, we were trying to, so there are various income surveys. There's the Authors Guild one, there's the ALCS one in the UK, there's the Canadian Authors one, and there's an Australian one. So we really wanted something that was going to line up properly, because otherwise it's really hard to compare. So the best way comparisons that we could do was to make sure that all the authors were doing 50% or more of their time was being taken up with writing and publishing. This does eliminate a group of authors. It eliminates everyone who just self-publishes a one-off book, because we felt that was not a very fair comparison, because there's a lot of people who just do their memoir, or they just do a book for their family, and that's all they ever wanted to do. And that's a difficult thing to bring into the mix. So it eliminated that, and it eliminated people who were just starting out, because we were trying to line them up to the ALCS one in the UK was using the 50%. The Authors Guild one uses pretty much full-time authors. So they have more the full-time ones that they're reporting back on. So we were trying to get somewhere lined up like that. It is tricky to line up the data. So because we did that, kind of eliminated a little bit that spike that you're talking about, because it eliminates for the traditionally published authors, these are people who are spending quite a lot of their time on this. So by this time, things like an advance should have evened out a little bit more, because they should be getting advances and the royalties and anything else that they do to bring in income streams like festivals, appearances, book signing, that kind of stuff. So that should have evened out a little bit for them. And for our one, we did a median. So that's not, I had to refresh my maths on this. We didn't do the mean, which would be take everybody's money and divvy it back out against the number of people you had. We did the median, which is the middle of a range of numbers. So it's the number most likely to be true for the largest group of people. And what that does is it removes those outliers. It takes out the people who are making the multi-millions, and it takes out the people who are right down on zero, to try and get you what would be, if you were spending 50% of your time, what would be the most likely number for you to be hitting. So that that methodology kind of evened out both of those things, I think, a little bit.
Yeah.
It is tricky, though. It's really tricky to get
Yeah.
it. What will be easier is that going forwards, we'll be able to match our data to our data rather
Right.
than our data to someone else's data, which is always a trickier thing to do.
Yeah. Thank you I like that explanation too of the different mathematical terms. That was good.
That's coming from a really non-mathematical person, so you know it has to make sense.
You faked it well.
Otherwise, I can't even say it.
So, what were some of the things that you found that you felt were the most illuminating from the point of view of the commercial insights that you would want to share with indie authors?
Yeah. So there's three big things that I saw. One is libraries are growing 45% on their revenue. So for the people who are taking part in the libraries, that's a really growing area. I think probably what's happening there is that the pathway into libraries is getting smoothed out a bit because the libraries are getting used to that. And then, and just like anything where you first start it out, there's going to be the outliers. They're sort of trying it. The library's a bit like, I don't know who you are, what you want, how's this going to work? And they're getting used to it. The logistics of it is getting smoothed out. The libraries are getting used to indies coming in. It's growing very, very fast. We had that in from draft to digital. So that's definitely an area for indie authors to look into. If you're not in libraries yet, look into how you go about getting into those. So that's one. The second thing that was fascinating is that readers are really leaning into diverse stories. And this is particularly coming in from the Gen Zs. So the Gen Zs are currently about 12 to 27 years old. And the slightly older age group, so the 18 plus, who are allowed to mess around on the internet more than everybody else, are really deliberately seeking out more diverse stories. They would like to see their own diverse selves reflected in the stories that they read. And I thought that was a really interesting thing to see, because not only are Gen Z wanting those diverse stories, they're really into reading. So the Gen Zs, there's been a whole spate of stories recently. 40% of them read every day. And I think more than 50% of them are reading several times a week. They are liking to go to libraries to socialize instead of coffee shops and things. They like those spaces. Possibly also because libraries in more recent years have really stopped being a kind of shush, shush, shush kind of place. And they've opened up a bit. They have bars, they have cafes, they have spaces where you can network and talk and nobody's going to go shush, shush, shush to you. My local library has a big networking sort of space, and they say, oh, we open it up for kids to come and study. And so they'll come into the library and they'll study together, and then they're making friends and they're talking to people. And they said it's really nice to watch that. And of course, then they're surrounded by books, and then they get more into the kind of book vibe generally. So it's quite nice to know that here's this young generation who are really into reading, because presumably they're going to take that through with them. And you have to hope that the Gen Alphas that are going to be next up after them are going to continue that pathway. So for authors, that's a fascinating thing to know, that you've got an up and coming, very into reading group who are searching for those diverse stories. So not only do they want lots of books, they would like them to have diverse characters in them. The other thing that's interesting is they like paperbacks. They want the bookiness of it, So that's interesting as well, because we all went ebooks, ebooks, ebooks. They're now kind of pushing a bit of an interest in paperbacks. And I think perhaps that's something to do with the physicality of it. So things like TikTok, you'll have the people with books in the background holding up the books. It becomes a prop. It becomes something an actual product that you talk about and interact with physically. So I really liked that. I thought that was an interesting thing for people to think about. And when I say diverse stories, I was chairing a panel at the London Book Fair, talking with various authors about this. And it's not so much we want diverse characters and we have to just focus on what their diversity is. It's diverse characters just doing their ordinary lives. They just want to see regular life with the diverse characters doing the regular stuff. And I think that opens it up to far more authors, really, because it stops being about, are you in a position to write that diverse author? Well, I am if they're running a bakery, and I'm just focusing on the bakery running of it. That's what they're there for. They're not there to investigate every aspect of their diversity. They're just running their normal life. And I think that is a really interesting and important and quite positive thing for all authors to think about. Are you including diverse characters who are just getting on with their lives like the rest of your characters are doing? Put everybody in there together. That's what life's like out there. So that's a nice thing to know.
Yeah.
And the third thing was the selling direct. And I know that people have been discussing this for a while and whatever, but it's really interesting how it suddenly picked up the pace. So this would have been very early spring 2023, Ally ran their survey and they showed that there was about 12%, 13% of authors in that survey were selling direct. And it was like, okay, well, it's a smallish group, really, but, okay, it's starting to be shown a little bit. Come the winter of that same year, Written Word Media ran their survey, which they do every year, really interesting insights they always have. They were up to 27%. So that's really fast. And you might think, well, hang on, you had different sets of data. Who knows? Maybe you didn't get your bit right or you didn't get your bit right. But what backed up that really quick growth was the Written Word Media's one asked also, how long have you been selling direct? And it was 40% of them was under a year, which is exactly like it was 1 year. And that's this huge group joining. All of a sudden you go from just over 10% to nearly 30%. And that's a really big growth in 1 year. So that's an interesting one, I think. And again, I think it's that thing where you have the outliers, they lead the way, they talk about it, they encourage people forwards. And then this has been, I think, a little bit of a shift to, okay, now a bigger group is coming online with this. And again, it's the logistics getting straightened out. So when we were at London Book Fair, Book Vault were talking about, there's a really just straightforward plugin for Wix websites to make the selling direct easier. So rather than having to sit there and go, oh, and how am I going to do that? And is it going to be really complicated? And do I have to link that to and you do that? More and more, the logistics are getting straightened out for you and an easier way you just go plug that in and get on with it. So that selling direct is it's getting into the norm rather than the sort of the outliers, I think. So I think those three things really interesting for authors to have a look at going forwards.
And it does seem like all of those are things that it's pretty easy to see how one would want to act on them, like popularity of libraries, make sure your books are available to libraries, more a craft tip about what you were discussing with regard to diversity and maybe an evolving perspective on what diversity means. If people are loving paperbacks, then make sure they're available in paperbacks. If direct sales is proving to be popular among readers, then tap into that. Were you able to look at the data in a way that said maybe those assumptions that you would make on the surface aren't necessarily true, or data that you were saying that would lead people to say, oh, this is something I should be doing less of? And I recognize that might be like two questions baked into one, but something beyond kind of the, oh, I see this is popular, I'm going to do it too response.
Yeah, interesting. I think one thing that was interesting from the first round of data we did was there's Holly Greenland, who is actually our blog manager at Ally, is doing her PhD in what behavioral aspects of self-published authors. And that was an interesting one because she was trying to see, are there certain behaviors or characteristics of authors that make them more or less likely to be successful? And the one characteristic that came up as being linked to success, so none of them were linking except for this one thing, which was not being amiable. And I was like, sorry, what? And she's like, yeah, self-published successful authors are not amiable people. We really laughed about that. But then we kind of broke it up a bit. We're thinking, what is that about? And really, it's having a bit of stubbornness. It's keeping going on the days when you get a crappy review or when, oh, there's another 1,000 words to write, or the editor sent you back something and, you got to do all that work. It's keeping going. It's not always being nice. It's not always, everything being sweetie pie and hunky dory. Sometimes you got to be a bit stubborn and have a thick skin and keep plodding on. And I just thought that was quite funny sometimes. I thought on the days when you feel like you've been, too abrupt with someone because you had to keep your word count or whatever, sometimes you have to not be as amiable. And I just thought that was a funny thing. So that was a fun one that came out. On the whole, what was interesting was that the self-published authors are very, very positive about self-publishing. So there was 93% of them were saying, yes, it is a positive experience for me. And that's a very high percentage in an area where, as we know, it's not like it just comes easy. You have to work pretty hard at it. But the positivity coming out was a really interesting aspect for me because I thought, people could go, oh, it's really hard or it takes a really long time to get, things moving or whatever. But actually, the overall response and the overall feedback to how do you feel about self-publishing was very, very positive. So that was a good thing to know that's overall a positive experience for indie authors.
Yeah. What you were saying about the amiability is, I think, especially funny because of any profession I've ever worked with, I think indie authors are among the most generous. So, that lack of amiability is the examples you gave totally make sense to me. But
on the surface, it sounds quite funny. On the surface, it sounds like this must be the terrible, curmudgeonly group of people. But they're not. They're, like you say, they're very generous. They're very open-hearted about sharing what's worked for them, what they think might work for other people, cheering each other on, all of that. Yeah. But somewhere at the core, there must be a core of non-amiableness that keeps you going on the tough days, I think. The other thing that's come out that's really interesting is that younger authors, so the under 45s, are now making self-publishing their first choice. It is not the plan B anymore. It's not, well, I tried traditional publishing and it didn't work, or I couldn't get, the agent, the publisher, whatever. And the reasons, so that was Authors Guild found that, but also on Holly's work, she was finding that when there was a list of, well, why did you pick self-publishing? A lot of it was around creative control and the higher royalties. And I couldn't find an agent or I couldn't find a publisher was really low down on the list. And that was beginning to show that actually more and more people are informed about all the options available to them. And they're choosing the self-publishing, which is a good thing to know. Presumably also helped by the fact that the other indie authors in the game who are already in the game are being positive about it.
Yeah. And I think that these kinds of collections of data will either become more complicated or less complicated, depending, or maybe both, in that I think that in the past, there used to be very clear indie versus traditional, or I'll even say self-publishing versus traditional. I don't like the phrase self-publishing, but that's what it was. It was like it's yourself or it's a company. And I think especially as authors start doing both, the idea that I guess someone is not an indie author, they are someone who's chosen an indie route for this particular book. And when the next book or series comes along, they're going to make a business decision about that book or series. And that focus on it's what you're doing with a particular piece of content, not what you're doing with your entire writing career. Do you think that will make it easier or more difficult to gather and assess this kind of data?
Well, it's harder to gather the data because even book sales, which are still not being tracked by the big book tracking organizations, are, it's already a struggle because already you can't just go, well, it's the ISBNs, just track them. It's like, nah, some people aren't using the ISBNs and some people are selling direct. And so, so there's a lot of lost data out there, which is a bit of a shame. On the other hand, I think as people get better at self-reporting, so they're more able to go, well, I do this and this and this. If you can follow what the big trends are, then you know the right questions to ask. We now know that we need to be including that selling direct data in there because that's going to become quite a significant part of the information out there. So that is part of why we went direct to authors, because we thought actually it's no good anymore just asking a particular platform. A particular platform can give you a big picture of what's a big trend happening, but you will never get the full picture of what an author's making except from that author. So it's complicated, but if you're watching the trends, it does help you to ask the right question and hopefully to gather the right data, which is always a useful thing to do, I think.
Were there any other insights you got in addition to the treatment of diverse characters, the inclusion of diverse characters that were more craft focused? Well, I guess in a sense, that thing about standalone versus series is sort of a combination of craft and business, as just as you were saying.
Yeah, there's an ongoing thing around going wide and Kindle Unlimited. Yeah. Which every time I see data, I think, right, so for once and for all, I will definitely see which way to go. And every time it goes, well, there's a lot of info on this and there's a lot of info on that. And I'm like, oh, we're back to it again. I mean, on the one hand, so Kindlepreneur and Kalytics both did some interesting data on Kindle Unlimited. and they were talking about, on the one hand, Kindle Unlimited has a lot of the big best-selling books. So when you look at the top 400 that is happening with Amazon every year, a huge and growing percentage of those are part of Kindle Unlimited. That, though, does not tell, that tells you what's kind of hot and new and, you know, brand new and out there, which is sort of the point of Kindle Unlimited. The point is to have exclusivity of the new stuff that comes out, but it doesn't, of course, take care of, well, what's happening with all the back catalogue. And as a lot of us know, the back catalogue is where a lot of the money is in the long term, because every new book is only new for a very short period of time, and then it moves into back catalogue, and that's got a really long running tail to it. And actually, I think indies do much better with their back catalogues because they don't just focus on that launch. They don't go, it's the make or break for 3 months and then that's it. Like, well, no, that's your launch bit. And then after that, it's got a long life. It's got a long life after you're dead. So, you know, never mind the bit where you're still alive and can look after it and make it interesting.
That would be a really interesting thing to see studies on, of how much money the backlist of a traditionally published author makes. It may be in comparison to an author who is in the indie ranks, but I would bet exactly what you're saying. Like when I describe the 4 C's of indie publishing, they are creativity, control, care, and cash. And the care is care of the backlist, because I feel intuitively that that is true, a benefit that indie authors have over traditionally published authors. But I don't know that I've ever seen any data about that.
No, that's an interesting one to think about. And I love the idea of back catalogs and also what happens after you're dead. I mean, we asked a whole load of it. It was part of our indie author income survey. And it was only a quarter of them had a will which mentioned their literary estate in any way, shape, or form. And, you know, you think that's 70 years of sales if someone were looking after it. And I like to do a talk about this sort of thing. And Georgette Heyer, so big romance Regency author, dead now for 50 years, still got 20 years left to run. And if you go and watch how her back catalogue is being looked after, it's really clever. You see how the covers are being changed regularly, how the quotes on the front, you know, the kind of testimonials, if you like, reviews, they change up who's saying them so that it's somebody new and relevant, and it's not someone you've never heard of who apparently was a big deal back when it was published. Every time Bridgerton comes out, a new series comes out, whoa, the sales spike like that. For the whole of the historical category, Lord knows what they're like for Georgette Heyer. They must really spike. And you think someone is doing a very good job of looking after that back catalogue, which you could have just let sink. You could have just gone, well, whatever. But no, there's a lot of books there and someone's doing a really good job looking after them. And I think all indie authors should have a little bit of a think about what's going to happen later on in life and what's going to happen when they die and what will happen to their literary estate. And go have a look at Georgette Heyer. Go see how well you can look after a series and what kind of money that might make for your estate. I think
it was a conversation that I either had with Orna or Michael Laron about this very thing. And I was saying, it seems as if there's maybe a newish profession within the indie author sphere of people whose entire job is to take care of your books, either after you've died or maybe even just after you've stopped wanting to muck around in it and you want somebody else to take care of it, kind of like an agent. I actually just talked to David Morris, who is an agent, but he's I think a very forward-thinking agent who is welcoming of what the indie publishing industry brings. And I think that he's doing somewhat different things for his clients, depending on what their publishing approach is, obviously. Yeah. But that there is the specialty of taking care of books after the author is either not there anymore to do it themselves or just not interested in doing it themselves anymore.
Yeah. Oh, I think there's a lot of scope for that. And I don't think it's quite taken off yet. But like you say, it should do really. At Ally, we have 2 books for our members, which are all about, you know, how to write that literary estate and a sort of handbook for your heirs to go, here, this is what you do when someone left you a pile of books and you're supposed to take care of them. But I think that's definitely a publishing service that could develop, because when you get older and you sort of semi-retire, but, you know, and write yourself a kind of process Bible that says, this is how often you should update the covers. This is the target audience. This is, you know,
Well, there
definitely.
was one other, I'm going to hold it for the moment because I think it would be a good wrap up comment. But were there any other things that struck you, and especially things that you saw going down, like losing popularity in the sense that you would want to alert indie authors that maybe this is something that they shouldn't be keeping at the top of their priority list anymore?
That's a good question. I have not seen things going down. It just all goes up and
It
up
all
and up.
goes
You
up.
have to do more and more things all the time. I said this to one the other day. I was like, there's always something else to do. And I was like, yes, there is always something else to do. I have not seen anything just really going down. I think, and you sort of slightly touched on that just before, I think authors who grow in success find more and more interesting income streams and platforms and outlets for what they're doing. And not only do they find things like, at the beginning, we say to everyone, you must have a mailing list, you must have subscribers, you must, and at the beginning, it may seem like, well, I'm not sure they're really doing anything. This doesn't seem to be whatever. But actually, Kindlepreneur showed that the selling direct was a lot better the more subscribers you had on your list. They literally had a chart showing you have this many subscribers, you get this much money. You have this many subscribers. So that was an interesting one. And then also, I think things like Kickstarter and Patreon become bigger the more you're linking, the more you've got those subscribers, the more you've got those different projects to play with. And then you start getting into, as you were saying, what do you do with each book that comes out or each series that comes out? What pathway do you take for it? And it isn't even just, shall I go trad or shall I go indie? It's even more split up than that. It's what shall I do with the paperback? What shall I do with the audiobook? What shall I do with, and it's each individual format you can tease out more and more into all its different component parts and think to yourself, what happens to the licensing rights for each one of those? Do I look after them? Do I hand them over to someone else? Shall I do, and that means that the more successful you are, the more options you have to split out into those tiny parts rather than the old model of here, you have everything and you sort it out. That's a really old model now. I don't think many people do that anymore, and certainly not the successful people. They're really splitting it down to the fine details, and each one of those they're considering, would it be better this route or would it be better that route? And I think that is where the success comes from, is really thinking through all your options for each potential, creative use of that IP.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that this idea that every report like this seems to put more work on the indie publisher's plate and not take much away, which I just think is the nature of a still maturing and growing career in industry. But I can see an analogy where, I think we've gotten past the point where, and this is one of the reasons I don't like self-publishing, because self-publishing sounds like you're doing it all yourself. And I think most professional indie publishers now recognize that they are wordsmiths, they are not visual design professionals, and so they should really get a visual design professional to produce their cover. Nobody can effectively edit their own work, so they really need to get a professional editor. I know for myself, I know I'm not a numbers person, and so I finally got to a point with my business where I said, I'm just going to hire somebody else to take care of it for me, because I recognize I'm never going to be able to take care of that side of things as effectively as I could. And I think that what is now a growing pool of data sort of suggests another area where people maybe need more help, because I see lots of pieces of data about this is becoming more popular, this is becoming less popular, 57% of authors are doing such and such. And a lot of times my response is, that's fascinating, but I have no idea how to act on that. Beyond the obvious things like, oh, yeah, I should still offer a paperback book. And, this is another way I can imagine there could be an evolving profession out there that is, I'm looking at the pool of data and now I'm boiling it down for you. And I'm saying, I understand the details, but this is how you should act on it. Do you have recommendations for people who are looking not just to understand the data better, but then to understand how they should be acting on it?
Well, two things. One is download the report that we've done and have a look at it, because we've made it so readable. It is very, very readable. It is lots of pictures. That sounds so patronizing. No, but it's broken up. It is not a report that just, it's not a report that just goes on and on and on, and you're going, where is the bit that I'm supposed to? It's not like that. It's very much, here's a headline figure. Have a think about that now. Here's another headline figure. Think about that now. And it's very much designed to be very readable and to take stuff away from it. Clear directions from it, not just go, lots of things are happening. Oh my God, that means there's lots more things to do. The other thing I think is really important for all indie authors is to know where you're at and to do the bit that's appropriate for where you're at. I meet people and they're like, oh my God, they've only just started. And they go, oh my God, all the things that you've done. And I'm like, but I've been doing this for 9 years. 9 years. So if you're looking at my stuff and starting to panic, and I'm not even the superstars, you shouldn't be panicking, because I had one book and I had 12 subscribers on my list, and one of them was my dad, and then he unsubscribed. Like, hello. And, it looks all swish when you look at the people ahead of you. You need to slow it down a little bit and do a little bit at a time. But if you have the guidance, it does help you, because if right away you get told it would be helpful to you to write in a series. So just consider that each time you sit down with a new book, think about whether it could be a series. From a creative point of view, do whatever you like, but know that this would be beneficial to you. And then, know that it's good to have a mailing list and subscribers. When someone then says, well, you should be selling direct, and you think, oh my God, that's another thing that I need to set up, blah, 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 blah. If it's panicking you, wait a little bit, because the logistics will get smoother, as they always do when something new comes in. And also, while the logistics are getting smoother, you can be building up your subscribers and your books, which the preneur people have clearly shown will make it a lot easier when you go into the direct sale. So rather than panic and think you must do everything, think about, where am I at right now? What would be the best thing for me to be putting in place so that when I get to that next bit, it will make it easier for me. I always, when I talk to brand new authors, I'm always like, let's get the foundations right. Do not go rushing off and trying to do something that you think looks all shiny and whatever. Let's get the foundations right. And because then when you stand on those, they'll be nice and solid under you. Don't build some crumbly plastic thing. Build something good and solid with bricks, and then it'll be easier at the next level. Yeah. And I think that happens all the way through. We are all guilty of, I do all the time. You look at the people up above you, and you go, oh my God, how did they do that? Oh, and I'm never going to catch up. Oh, and I should do all these things. But actually, just think about where you've got to so far, and logically, what would be the next good thing to move up to, little bit by little bit. Well, I do like having data, because otherwise, I think you're just looking at the shiny stuff and you think you need to do all of that immediately. If you have the data in front of you, you can go, okay, looks like that's a good thing to be doing. How would I get one step closer to that?
Yeah, I think that my author friends will laugh, because I'm currently on a campaign to get people to stop saying just. And one of them is, I'm just going to self-publish it. And I was like, okay, that pains me for so many reasons. But the other thing I hear all the time is that I think that we're surrounded by the superstar stories. And if we're talking about email newsletter subscribers, then, I only have 12 subscribers. No, you have 12 subscribers. You can't expect to sell 1,000 books off the 12 subscribers, but, you have 12 subscribers. And I've even heard people saying like, oh, I only have 15,000 subscribers. And I'm like, that really makes me feel like lying down and taking a nap, because now, it's like inciting comparisonitis. Now you've seen like what the superstar is doing. And you think, oh, well, obviously I should have 15,000 subscribers. And so I think a real benefit of having the data and not just having the window dressing can really help people make more realistic assessments of their career and where they want to head it.
Yes, I think so. And I think that it allows you to see the bigger picture, to go, okay, this is what's happening. The median amount of money is this. Okay, where do I stand in relation to that? What does it look like those authors are doing? And what could I do to move closer towards that? It's just a little bit by a time. people always they have a funny way of looking at being an author compared to any other job, and I'm always like, but it's like any other job. You don't take someone straight out of school, stuff them in a job, and then come back a year later and go, why are you not the CEO? Why would you be the CEO? You're making coffee for everyone and doing what you're told and doing the photocopying, After a bit, you'll get a little bit better and a little bit better and a little bit better. And if I come back in 10 years, then it would be reasonable to say, how you getting on? And, have you been promoted a couple of times? And what have you got your eye on for the future? I don't expect to come back and hear that you're the CEO, because even after 10 years, that'd be doing some. I mean, you have to have a sense of comparing it to a real job. It's a real job. It's not we have too many shiny star stories, I think.
Yes.
And not enough middle stories. I like the middle stories. I like the ones where you're making the same money you were making in whatever job it was you did before you became an indie author. To me, that is a big success story, because you managed to equal or go above that salary. That's great. The super million whatevers, I mean, that's wonderful too, but that's a whole other thing.
Yeah.
It's about, is it a real job? The more you think of it as a real job, the better.
And I think that people should separate in their minds the aspirational goals without denigrating what they've done. So if you have 12 email subscribers, then of course you probably want 20, but you shouldn't be denigrating the fact that you have 12 on your way to 20,
and also, Yeah, but also the fact that you have 12, that means you must have set up a website and a mailing list, and you got some people to sign up. You've probably got some kind of reader magnet or something that's getting them onto that list, because they don't just sign up for nothing.
Yep.
So actually, that must mean an awful lot of your foundational stones are getting in place, because otherwise that wouldn't have happened at all. So
yeah, we've gone from...
And I think you panic less over time.
Yes. We've morphed from data discussion to therapy for
we're
independent publishers.
It's a whole other podcast. It should be a podcast. It's therapy. I'm sure that there really should be.
Today's caller is worried that they only have 15,000 email subscribers.
Yeah. Today's caller is crying because their dad unsubscribed from their 12 subscribers. We have to talk them down, Yeah.
Well, Melissa, always so lovely to talk to you, as I think our listeners can tell. And I'm sure people are going to be intrigued by this report. So where can they go to download their own copy of the report?
Absolutely. So it's allianceindependentauthors.org/facts. And you will find there both the very latest one, but also scroll down the page a little bit further. You'll see notices to it, and get last year's one as well, because we tried not to repeat. We didn't just repeat the data. We put all new data. And last year's one is just as worth reading as this year's.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matty. Always a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Melissa. What was the biggest surprise for you from the big indie author data drop results? What data bore out what you believed about indie publishing? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Just leave a comment on YouTube, and while you're at it, please subscribe. And if you got value from this episode and were thinking, I wish I could buy Matty a cup of coffee, you can do that. Scroll to the bottom of any page at theindieauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.